Our next session was a lot of fun to plan. And our next keynote speaker is the general manager of the medical. Can I ask you guys to shh and maybe close the doors outside? Thanks. Okay, sorry about that. So anyway, we'll start all over. So Karthik is the general manager of the medical and high reliability businesses at Texas Instruments. We've all heard of them. They've been around for years, but they've been doing unbelievable things that are all behind the scenes. So along with his team, he focuses on health, fitness, and the medical imaging sector, developing game-changing semiconductor technologies. Fun fact about him, he's a huge Star Wars fan. And he has this dream to invent a lightsaber Gangnam Style. So I'm going to let him explain that because I could never begin to, but I'm kind of intrigued. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this last talk. So there are two things I want you to remember about this talk. One, when it's done, you can leave and go to drinks. And the more important one is I didn't do that dance and completely ruin your appetite. So those are the two things I want you to remember. So actually, on a more serious note, Gangnam Style, obviously it's everywhere. It's been downloaded 1 billion times, and you may like it, you may not like it, but you can't avoid it. And it's kind of cool. Now, if you think of silicon technology, it's kind of cool as well. I mean, if you look in your pockets, you have your cell phone, whole bunch of silicon in there. You have your laptops, whole bunch of silicon. And then you just heard about health technology. Obviously, everyone's worried about their health and want to take care of it. So that's everywhere as well. So that's the connection I wanted to make between Gangnam Style, silicon, and health and technology, which I'm going to talk about today. The main message I want to tell you today is that silicon technology has a couple of cool things it can do. It can make things small. It can make things low power. And then really, that with the software and applications that we just heard of can really make for very compelling products. So the idea is to show you the kinds of things we can do and then give you those ideas, and maybe we'll invent a few more devices. So with that, let's get into it. So I wanted to name this person Mr. G. So the whole talk is going to be the story of Mr. G here who's dancing, who gets up one morning and says, I want to take care of my health. And he actually goes down to the South Hall, and he sees all these cool health and fitness devices, and he wants to buy himself a few of those. So he picks up the armbands, the chest bands, the watch, the shoes. I mean, he has all these things available. But each one of those products actually does three main things. It senses something about his body. So it's basically taking some signals, some blood pressure maybe, temperature, heart rate, and it's doing some kind of conversion, which is the compute function. And then more and more we see that people want to transmit it somewhere, maybe to the cloud. It's just not a display. You want to do something with that data. So Mr. G basically picks up this device, and that device needs to do at least three things well. It needs to sense, it needs to compute, and it needs to transmit. The underlying factor about all this, below all this, is those devices are small, and they're low power. They can run off a coin cell. Maybe they run for months or maybe for weeks. So that's really what silicon technology can do for us, is make the sense, compute, and transmit for really low power in a very small form factor, so that all kinds of devices can be built. You can build a button, maybe. You can build a fashion accessory. You can put it in your shoe. You can put it in your glasses. So that's what silicon technology is enabling. So the story of Mr. G actually continues with those three main functions that I'm going to explain in a little bit more detail. So you got to click through that. Yep. So Mr. G purchases this device. And then he has these three little sensors on him that you see here. And of course, as an electrical engineer, you're very, very intrigued when you think of a block diagram. So what I show you here is the block diagram of the sense, the compute, and the transmit function. So you see that he has these little sensors on his body, obviously trying to measure his position, maybe how many calories he's burning, his temperature. There are a couple of very interesting facts about the human body. Most of the signals are very slow. If you think of your temperature, it's not really changing a whole lot. and it doesn't change between a whole range, maybe 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit, that's about it. And it does not change very often. So really, you're talking about very slow-moving signals. And then if you look at, let's say, your heartbeat, maximum 200 beats a second. So once again, very, very slow. I mean, obviously, if you think of silicon technology, you're thinking about gigahertz. I mean, you're talking about multi-gigahertz. Here, we're really talking about, hundreds of hertz at maximum. But the interesting fact is, the body is producing these signals at an extremely low level. So you're really basically getting nanovolts or microvolts of signal. So this whole sense function is about taking that really small, slow-moving signal, amplifying it, and really converting it into the digital domain. So that's really what these first 2 blocks are doing. So if we continue down the story and go to the next slide, here Mr. G is happy that he's got his data out of his sensors, and it's converted into the digital domain, and it's going to this block called a microcontroller. And once again, this microcontroller is not running at gigahertz. It's really running extremely slow, megahertz at most. And then really what we're trying to do here is take all this digital data and compute numbers that we understand, a blood pressure reading, a temperature, the number of calories burnt. So that's what this microcontroller is doing. The interesting thing about this whole setup is it doesn't need to run all the time. So if Mr. G is asleep, the number of steps don't matter. So that portion of the microcontroller can be shut down. When he's running, of course, that's important. So the idea is, how do we conserve power? How do we turn off blocks when not needed? So that's the trick. So most of the people who are creating applications on the microcontroller domain are playing those tricks, how to conserve power and how to get meaningful data out of these digital bits that's coming out of this signals conditioning block. Of course, the most interesting part of it is this next function, which is the transmit. So Mr. G is actually a very competitive guy. So he wants to compete with his friends who are sitting across the world and tell them, hey, I ran 5 miles today. So the idea is to take this data and transmit it into the web or into the cloud. And it can be used for many different applications. It could be simple things like competition with your friends. Of course, it could be for more serious issues like what happens in the hospital. It could be going into your smartphone app. So basically, we can transmit all this data and do things with it. Once again, the data rates are very, very low. You're really transmitting numbers. You're not transmitting a video. You're not transmitting music. So once again, this whole environment is very good for low-power applications. So you can actually optimize this whole system to consume very little power. Now, this one block that I didn't talk about is this power block. And that really is also very key to this block diagram. It basically takes a coin cell and makes it last for months. You can boost the voltage to run your transmitter. You can run your microcontroller at maybe below 1 volt. So all kinds of technologies exist in this power management domain as well. So that's really what we do to make these devices run for a very long period of time. A very interesting concept is we could actually do energy harvesting as well. So if you think of solar-powered watches, they've been around for a long time. Mechanically, automatic winding watches have been there for 40 years. So in a way, you could think of merging and those energy harvesting techniques with this block diagram to really make a perpetual sensor or a sensor that lasts for a long period of time. Let's say it's embedded in your clothing and it's going to last for the 2 years that you're going to use that shirt. So those kinds of technologies are very readily available, and we can actually use them. So now we're going to leave Mr. G out for a few minutes and really come back to the history of semiconductor scaling. This is a very interesting graph. On the x-axis, you have time, which is linear. Probably, Mr. G was born in 1970, so he's about 40 years old now. But if you look at the y-axis, it's actually logarithmic scale. So in those 40 years, silicon technology has basically shrunk by more than 1,000 times, actually closer to 10,000x. So really put in perspective, silicon has enabled these big to small transitions. So if in the 80s, if you probably had a cell phone, it was really not a cell phone. It was maybe a cell case. It was a big box that you carried. Maybe had a talk time of 20 minutes, and then that's all it really did. Now, if you look at your smartphone, it can do all kinds of things. Of course, it still has the talk time, but you can do other things with it. And that's really enabled for a large part by this shrinking in technology. Of course, not to mention the software and the innovation that people are actually applying on top of that silicon technology. My biggest, I guess, experience with this is when I was growing up in the 1980s, I got my first TRS-80 Radio Shack computer, and it had 4 kilobytes of memory in it. And then you could buy a 16 kilobyte extension, which was the size of a brick, and you attached it, and you felt you could conquer the world. With 20 kilobytes of memory, you could do whatever you wanted. Now we're talking about terabytes of memory, really, that can fit in the palm of your hand. That's the level of technological, I guess, progress that's being made in silicon technology. A really, really bad analogy would be that if this 10,000x was applied to fuel efficiency of cars, you could actually travel around the world with 1 gallon of gas. But anyway, I mean, there are other reasons why that will never happen, but that's the kind of progress that silicon technology has made. So I wanted to talk about size. The next thing I wanted to talk about was power, because that's also a critical component of this whole story. Now, power is interesting because you have devices that are plugged in, that need to be plugged in. You have devices that can work on a battery for days, maybe for weeks, but really we're talking about technologies that hopefully can last for months. And I think a lot of human psychology also comes in here. You have a cell phone, and you're used to charging it maybe once a day, and if you talk a lot, maybe twice a day. But if you had a device that said, hey, you got to charge this every 3.5 days, that might be tough for us to do. So you got to kind of fall into maybe charging once a day, or maybe not charging it at all. So power management and power is also actually very, very important feature along with the scaling that is shown. The next thing is connectivity, and I want to draw your attention to this little bubble on the left-hand side. We all know the home area network, so you have your smartphones, your laptops, your refrigerators, your home security system, all kind of network together, and then they can talk to the local area network, they talk to the World Wide Web. But really the interesting concept is what is shown here, body area network. So Mr. G, think of Mr. G having all these sensors on his body, and they're all talking to each other. And those technologies exist. And when they're talking to each other, of course, they talk to an aggregator, maybe your cell phone, that then puts all that information into the World Wide Web. So I think there's going to be this body area network as the next area of network development that's going to be coming out in the next few years. And then in the middle section, you see all the various wireless standards, depending on what kind of distance you want to transmit your data, what kind of power you want to transmit it at. So you have sub-gigahertz band, you have the wireless LAN, you have Bluetooth low energy, a whole bunch of standards. And what I'm trying to show on the right-hand side is the applications that you would use and what kind of radio standards you would use. So let's take vital signs monitoring. That's interesting. You have a smart bandage. Maybe you'd use the sub-1 gigahertz band for transmitting the data that's coming out of that system. Maybe you're doing patient monitoring. Maybe you're going to use the ISM band, or maybe the wireless LAN infrastructure that exists within the hospital. So the point of this slide is we have a whole bunch of connectivity options that we have. The interesting fact is I think the body is going to become its own local area network. And then you're going to have sensors on your body that are going to be talking to each other. So now if you take the size, power, and connectivity, now you can do a whole bunch of things with it. And the next two slides basically show you examples of those transitions in the medical space. So if you look at the first ECG, probably done about 110 years ago, it occupied a room. And if you're lucky, you got a good reading out of it. And now we are saying we can make these little personal devices that people can measure their own ECG. Of course, we heard in the previous panel, what you do with the data is could be interesting. Is it your data? How do you manipulate it? There are issues with it, but the fact is that silicon technology, along with innovation, from people who can use that silicon technology, has really enabled this transition from a room-sized device into a handheld device. The other examples would be in electronics. You can have, from universities, you see epidermal electronics, so completely flexible electronics with the electronics and the sensors kind of on this flexible substrate that you can place on your body. I mean, a smart bandage kind of concept. It's there. You can have pills that you take that can take pictures of the inside of your body. It can maybe monitor when you're taking your pills. Are you taking the right dosage? It can talk to your smartphone. So you have those technologies. And of course, you have the more traditional health and fitness devices that we see at CES. So once again, This is not to show an exhaustive set of examples, but it's to just show that these kind of examples exist. They exist outside the body, and they exist inside the body. And you can do a whole bunch of electronics and a whole bunch of measurements with the electronics that you have. Now, this is also an interesting slide. Maybe 10 years ago, hospital was basically what you thought of medical electronics. If you thought of medical electronics, you thought of the hospital. You maybe thought of an X-ray machine or a CT scanner or an ultrasound machine, or maybe even an ECG machine, but they were all in the hospital. But this outward bubble, or outward pressure of this bubble was really driven by people wanting to know more about themselves. So you basically had electronics from the hospital migrate into the doctor's office. So you had big, huge cart-based ultrasound machines become small portable ultrasound machines. You had film-based digital X-ray become electronics-based digital X-rays. So all those little things moved into the doctor's office. And now we see that continued pressure outward, where you're moving out of the doctor's office to get this health care basically moving anywhere. So you have your personalized medicine, you have your emergency response medicine, where ambulances have ultrasound machines in them. You can actually look at the patient at the accident site and make decisions on what needs to be done. And of course, we talked about the body area network. And of course, all these things are connected in some form or fashion to the World Wide Web. So that, in a nutshell, is what I was trying to convey today. Is silicon technology has really helped, and of course, actually not so much the silicon technology itself, but it's people wanting to know more about themselves that has driven this outward motion of this healthcare opportunity. So with that, I wanted to conclude my talk by saying that silicon technology makes things possible, but it's really the killer applications that makes that technology and puts it into customers' hands and really makes it necessary. And with that, the idea was, with this technology, where would you people actually take this technology and get to greater heights and new devices and a whole bunch of innovation that comes in the future. Thank you.
Did anyone have any other? Sorry, was there any questions? Did we not open it up to questions? I'm sorry. I had to run to the restroom. Okay. I want to thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Gangnam Style, it was fantastic.
Thanks.